Hello everyone, welcome to this video. So as the PMP exam is all set to transition from its current PMBOK 7th edition to the PMBOK 8th edition in July this year, I know many of you will be trying to clear the exam within the next 3 to 4 months. And on the other hand, some of you might be thinking of waiting until July 2026 to take the exam in its new format, which is perfectly fine as well. Now, to help both of you manage this transition smoothly, I will be doing some bonus PMP exam questions and answers practice sessions like these over the next few months. And the intent of these sessions would be to practice the types of questions common within the exam syllabus, both for the current format of the exam and the new format of the exam. Because, believe it or not, even with this new transition, about 70 to 80% of the PMP exam syllabus will still stay the same. So regardless of whether you plan to write the PMBOK 7th edition or let's say the PMBOK 8th edition of the exam, these practice sessions, in addition to my regular monthly Q&A sessions, are going to help you prepare for the PMP exam with the right mindset. So 5 questions common across both the PMBOK 7 and the PMBOK 8 syllabus. Let's get started.
Right. So the first question, guys, pause the video, read the question properly and try to answer it before moving forward. Okay, so we'll start solving the question together. One of your team members have become suddenly unavailable during the project due to long-term illness. Okay, now this is an unplanned event. This has resulted in rescheduling of certain project activities which were on critical path. In a project review meeting, you find out that one critical path activity and a couple of subcritical path activities are planned to occur at the same time now. Now here you need to understand at least the basic difference of a critical path and a subcritical path, right? So I would recommend that you go and watch this video on my YouTube channel, which talks about the key difference between a critical path and a subcritical path. Okay, so it will be expected, guys, that you know the basics of these finer nuances of the different topics of project management when you are writing the PMP exam. Okay, right. So the question is, the sponsor is concerned about the situation. What should be your first step as a project manager? So if we go back to the framework that we have discussed in this video, so the first step is to read the question, read the options and try to categorize it as a type 1 or a type 2 question. Okay. Now, if you see the stem of this question, which is asking about the first step you should do as a project manager, this typically hints to a type 2 question, right? Which is directed towards assessing your understanding about the various steps in project management as the PMBOK mandates. Okay. So with that in mind, let's start evaluating the options A, B, C, and D. And while evaluating that, we'll keep the positive bias principle in mind, which means that we'll not eliminate any option from the table until and unless there is a solid reason to reject that option. Okay, right. So option A, perform an assessment of the risks introduced as a part of this replanning. Now, this seems to be quite a reasonable approach to me, that you are performing an assessment first and then you plan on the different actions which may or may not be taken, etc., etc. So we'll hold this option for now. Option B, plan to stick to the baseline to avoid any risks occurring. Now, realistically, guys, this will not be possible, right? Because you are already off baseline at the moment and the risk has already happened in your project. So it is not a risk anymore. It's an issue which you need to handle, right? So that way, option B is incorrect. Moving on, option C, review the risk register and prioritize the risks. Now, this is also an incorrect option, guys, okay? Because in the essence, you need to understand that first, when a risk has happened, the first thing is not that you start reviewing your risk register and start prioritizing the risks, right? You have to do an assessment of the risk first. You have to plan the risk responses, etc., etc. Okay, so that way, option C is jumping steps, and that is why option C is an incorrect option. Option D, Plan responses for the risks introduced as a part of this replanning. Now, this is also a very, very close option, guys. Okay. Now, what is a smart way of knowing what is the correct answer between option A and option D, guys? Okay. Now, for that, you need to refer to this table of the 49 processes of PMBOK, which is a part of your process group practice guide as well. And in this table, if you look at this section of the risk response planning, what is the first step? The first step is identifying the risk. Okay. Next is to perform a qualitative risk assessment, and then it is to perform a quantitative risk assessment. So essentially what you are doing through these two techniques, you are assessing the impact of the risk. Okay. And after that, you go ahead and plan your risk responses, right? So it's very, very clearly mandated as a part of the process group practice guide that what would be the steps in terms of doing a risk assessment when a risk occurs in your project. You jump a step, you get your answer incorrect. So with that logic, you can definitely say that option A here is the correct option because it hints to the first step of the risk assessment procedure, which is to perform an assessment of the risks. You can use quantitative methods, you can use qualitative methods, whatever works for you. But in the end, you should not jump steps when you are answering questions like this. Okay. Why plan risk responses is incorrect? This is because it is jumping steps and it is suggesting that you plan responses even before you do an assessment. Okay, so that is not according to the PMBOK guideline. So that is why the correct answer to this question is option A, which is to perform an assessment of the risks introduced as a part of this replanning. Now, there is a full video on my YouTube channel, guys, which will help you to understand how you can memorize this daunting chart of the 49 processes of PMBOK using pattern and logic, right? So you need not to do a rote memorization. Just by identifying some pattern and using some common sense, you will be able to recall this chart in your exam as the need may be. Okay, so for this question, we recalled the portion of risk management, right? And that was enough to help us understand why A is the correct answer and D was the incorrect answer. Okay, so I would recommend that you go ahead and watch this video from my YouTube channel as well. Okay, and now let's move on to question number 2. Right. So question number 2, guys, pause the video, read the question properly and try to answer it before we move forward. Okay. Right. So let's start solving the question. In a mobile app development project, which started with a fairly defined scope, the product owner has highlighted that the application will fail to meet some of the key requirements due to an inherent design flaw. Okay. Correcting this will take the project well over its set tolerances of time and cost, and the project sponsor is reluctant to sign off additional time or any additional funding for the project as well. Okay, what should the project manager do first? Okay, now if we try to categorize it as a type 1 or a type 2 question, this looks like a type 2 question which talks about a sequence of approach in which you should address a problem as a PMP style project manager. Okay, I would recommend that you go back and watch this video on my YouTube channel that talks about how to deal with type 1 and type 2 questions. Okay, so this is a type 2 question. Now let's look at the options one by one. Option A, call a meeting with the customer and negotiate an acceptance. Okay, now this is a very, very less preferable option, guys, because in the end, your first approach as a project manager is not to go to the customer and start negotiating a scope miss, okay, from your side basically. Okay, so it is very important that if there is a mistake that has happened in the project for scope miss, for maybe any changes in the requirements which you were not able to incorporate at the right point of time, your first action should not be to go and ask for a benefit of doubt from the customer and negotiate acceptance. Okay, that may be the last option you would like to explore, but it is definitely not the first option. Okay, so that is the reason why option A is incorrect. Option B, explore fast tracking options to accelerate schedule. Okay, now if you know fast tracking, guys, it generally comes with an additional cost. Okay, so even if you are able to gain on schedule, there is a high probability that you will end up spending more funds in the project to execute the fast tracking options. Okay, so that is the reason option B is incorrect as well, because if you see here, your sponsor is not allowing you additional time, nor he or she is allowing you any additional funding as well. Okay, let's look at option C, raise a change request to initiate design correction. Now, this may look like a feasible approach on the face of it, but consider this, that once you raise a change request, there is additional time to process the change request, to evaluate the change request, to ask for additional funding at the end of the change request, or maybe additional time at the end of the change request, etc., etc. Okay, so it's a fairly long drawn process, guys, and for that reason option C is also not a very feasible option to me. Okay, so I will eliminate option C as well. Now let's look at the final option, which is option D. Perform a risk review meeting with best value option analysis, and that looks like a very feasible option to me. Now when you do a risk review meeting, you evaluate the different options as a part of the risk response. Okay, so for example, in this scenario, a risk response could be rolling out a mini version of the project as a minimum viable product. That can be one of the responses. Okay, another response could be maybe looking for outsourcing some low cost design components to make the product work as per the specifications. That can be another option. Maybe you cut a few scope items just to make the product work, and then you see how you can manage the scope and schedule at the later stages of the project to accommodate the rest of the requirements. Now, there can be a lot of options, guys, but what a risk review meeting does is that it evaluates all these options and performs a risk to reward ratio or a risk benefit analysis to recommend the best option forward. Okay, so that looks like a very reasonable approach to me, and that is the reason why option D is the correct answer to this question. Question number 3, guys. Pause the video, read the question, and try to solve it before we solve this together. Right, so let's start solving the question. The server upgrade project by CloudSpace has 3 deliverables and they follow the mentioned execution approaches as below. Okay, so this question is basically from the topic of selection of the right project management approach from Agile, Hybrid, or Predictive. Okay, so let's go back to the question. So phase 2 has strict delivery milestones with clear scope and quality metrics. So it has 3 deliverables, right? So let's say this is the second deliverable which is happening as part of phase 2, and phase 2 has strict delivery milestones with clear scope and quality metrics. Now let's have a look on what's happening with phase 1 and phase 3. So for phase 1 and phase 3, these are exploratory in nature with evolving requirements. Okay, what is the most suitable life cycle for this project? And it has given you 4 options: A, B, C, and D. Now, to solve this question correctly, you need to have a very good understanding of the project methodologies. What are the criteria and the characteristics of a predictive or a waterfall project? In which situations you apply a hybrid project? What are the main conditions where a agile project is most suitable, etc., etc. So if you have that basic knowledge, you should be able to answer this question very easily and very quickly as well. I have covered such kind of critical concepts and topics as a part of my 35 PDU course on Udemy, right? So those of you who are students of that course, you should find this question quite easy to solve. Okay, so let's look at the options one by one. Option A, fully agile. Now I will not even read this next part of the option, guys. Okay, because primarily it is saying that phase 2 has strict delivery milestones with clear scope and quality metrics, and this is one of the primary reasons why we can safely interpret that this phase 2 of the project needs to follow a predictive or waterfall approach. So definitely the project cannot be fully agile. Okay. Next, option B, hybrid. Okay, so that's a good option, because if this part of the project is predictive, and since phase 1 and phase 3 are exploratory with evolving requirements, we can safely assume that this would somewhat follow our agile methodology. Then definitely this project is a hybrid project. Okay, now let's read the second part of option B. With phase 2 as predictive and phase 1 and phase 3 embedded as agile. Okay, now this looks like a very good option, because it is essentially saying what we have already discussed, right? That since phase 2 has strict delivery milestones with clear scope, you do phase 2 as a predictive project, and phase 1 and phase 3 happens as a agile project. Let's look at option C. Again, it's mentioning that it's a hybrid project with phase 2 as a single user story based sprint cycle. Okay, now it's getting confusing here. And phase 1 and phase 3 as iterative, right? Now, if you try to analyze this option in two parts, there is basically nothing wrong with this part of the option where it's saying that you do phase 1 and phase 3 as iterative, which makes sense because they are exploratory in nature with evolving requirements. However, if we come to the first part of this option, it is mentioning that phase 2 needs to be executed as a single user story based sprint cycle. Okay, now that makes this option quite incorrect because, as you see here, since phase 2 has strict delivery milestones with clear scope and quality metrics, there is no point having a sprint or taking an agile approach for phase 2 of the project, right? So that is the reason why option C is incorrect, because it is not a recommended approach to deliver a phase which has strict delivery milestones and clear scope and quality metrics as part of a agile sprint. Okay, so that is why option C is incorrect. Option D, now I will not even read the second part of this option, because if it is fully predictive, whatever reasoning you provide, that is not correct, because this project cannot be fully predictive because phase 1 and phase 3 are exploratory in nature and you have to have a iterative or a agile based approach for phase 1 and phase 3. So that is the reason why option D is also incorrect, because it's saying that the project could be done as a fully predictive project with defined scope statement and a weekly milestone schedule. Okay, now you cannot have a weekly milestone schedule definitely for a scope which is exploratory in nature and which has evolving requirements. Okay, so that is the primary reason why option D is also incorrect. So the correct answer to this question is option B, where you do phase 2 as a waterfall or a predictive scope, and phase 1 and phase 3 is embedded over the entire life cycle of the project to be executed in an agile approach. Okay, so question number 4, guys. The drill remains the same. Read the question and try to answer it before we solve it together. Right, so let's start. Some of your agile team members have gone into unplanned leaves and a couple of your coders have called off sick. Okay, so very bad situation in your agile team as far as resourcing is concerned. Since you are facing a severe resourcing issue, you decide to outsource some stories from the ongoing team to a freelance based technology firm. Okay, in the first sprint, the freelance team were not able to comprehend all the remaining user stories, okay, but were able to complete some of the most complex ones which were left off by your team. Okay, what should you do as a project manager in this situation to keep the progress on track for the project? And it has given you 4 options. So let's start evaluating the options one by one. Provide a new set of user stories to the freelance team. Okay, so that is incorrect, right? So you are already in a sprint, you are already in an iteration working with a set of user stories. Now giving a new set of user stories to this freelance team will not help you anyways to keep the iteration of the sprint on track and taking a step forward the project itself on track, right? So that option is incorrect. Let's look at option B. Reprioritize the backlog to match the freelance team skills. Okay, now this is a very interesting one, because if you see here, the freelance team is already able to solve most of the complex items as part of story points which they have picked up in their sprint, right? So that way, clearly there is a shift in terms of the skill set of this freelance team versus your core agile team, right? So it makes perfect sense to reprioritize the backlog to match the freelance team skills. So for example, you can give all the complex story points with which your team was struggling to this freelance team and leave the other story points for your team when your resourcing issue is resolved. Okay, so this option captures that very well. So we'll park this option now. Okay, because as per the 4-step framework that we have learned in this video, we need to evaluate all the options first before we zero in on one option. Option C, hire additional team members within your agile team. This is random, guys, right? I hope none of you have selected this, because now going into another hiring cycle, HR will be involved, your project sponsor will be involved, it might need additional budget, etc, etc. Okay, not at all a realistic action plan. Okay, next, option D, work on developing a cost plus incentive fee contract for the freelance team. Okay, so funny thing is, you have already done the outsourcing, right? So this option is saying that after you have done the outsourcing, now you prepare the contract, right? So this doesn't make sense, right? So even if someone can argue that cost plus incentive fee contract is very suited for agile led projects which has an open scope, complex scope, etc., it doesn't matter in this scenario because you have already outsourced this to the freelance team, and that has to be based on some contract, right? You cannot outsource something without a contract. So this option might seem correct prima facie, but if you look into it very closely, you will see that this option is telling you that after you have done your outsourcing, then you go ahead and work on developing a contract. Okay, that is not in line with the basic principle of procurement, right? Because in a procurement you have to have a contract first before you give out the job to a sub supplier or to a subcontractor or to a freelancing organization. Okay, so that is why option D is incorrect as well, and the correct answer to this question is option B. Question number 5, guys. Pause the video, read the question properly, try to select an answer from A, B, C, or D before we go ahead and discuss the solution. Right, so let's start solving this question. The principal designer of a tunnel construction project has been reassigned to another project by his functional manager without the project manager's approval. So this often happens in a matrix environment where the project resources have a functional manager, which is the direct line of reporting, and at the same time they are assigned as a project team member and has a dotted line reporting to the project manager. Okay, so that's the essence of a matrix organization. The project team has expressed concern that this will slow down the project and may also cause design inefficiencies in the final product. So what is the issue, guys? The issue is your project team has expressed concern that this will cause some problems in the project. It may cause design inefficiencies, it may slow down, it might increase the project cost, etc. Okay. What should be the most effective action by the project manager to resolve this? Again, if we look at the stem of the question, this is a typical type 1 question. So we will trigger the ideal project manager behavior framework in combination with the positive bias principle. Option A, review the situation with the sponsor and formulate a response. So with that, what you are doing is you are escalating this to your sponsor. And remember, guys, in your PMP exam, in 99% of scenarios where the option talks about reviewing something with the sponsor, informing something to the sponsor, getting direction about something from your sponsor, so these are typically wrong options. Okay, again, I have said 99%, but I have not said 100%, right? So there is still 1% of scenarios where escalating to a sponsor or let's say reviewing something with the sponsor makes sense. But here in this scenario, you as the project manager should take the call on what is the most effective way of resolving this situation. Reviewing this situation with the sponsor is not a PMBOK way of project management, and that is why option A is incorrect. Option B, hire an external design consultant to build design capability within the project team. Now, this is a very unrealistic option, guys, and that is why it is important to have real life project management experience for PMP exam. And it is because of primarily two reasons why option number B is incorrect. Reason number one, hiring an external design consultant will have financial implications in your project, right? It will not come for free. So that's point number one, and that needs to be assessed with the project funding. And the second reason why option B is incorrect is due to the unrealistic expectation that since your principal designer has now left, you start building the design capability within your entire team, because that honestly can take a long time and might not be very suitable for your project timelines, right? So that is why, because of these two primary reasons, option B is incorrect as well. Option C, acknowledge the concerns raised by the team and perform an impact analysis. Okay, so you can hold this option, looks like a decent option to me. Acknowledging the concerns, so you are acknowledging it as a servant leader and you are performing an impact analysis. Okay, let's hold this option for now. Option D, use coaching tools and techniques to keep the project team motivated. Okay, now you know what? That also looks a reasonable option to me because the project team is really concerned here, right? Now their concerns can be valid, can not be valid. That needs to be assessed. Okay, but as the project manager, you first need to understand and resolve their concerns. Right, so we'll hold option D as well. So with the first level of iterations, we have eliminated option A, eliminated option B, left with option C and option D. Now let's look at these two options very closely in context of the scenario, guys. What is the problem you are trying to solve in this question? Are you trying to resolve the concerns of your project team, or you are doing a impact analysis of this change where the principal designer has left your project team. Which is the problem you are trying to solve, guys? Tell me honestly. Of course, it is the issue that your team is concerned, right? Now, this may slow down the project, this may not slow down the project, okay? That will come into consideration when you do the triple constraint analysis of this issue which has happened, okay? But the problem which you are trying to resolve in this scenario is to address the concerns of your team. And that can be done using coaching tools and techniques to keep your project team motivated, guys. Okay. Acknowledging the concerns and performing an impact analysis might have been a good idea if the primary problem you were trying to solve through this scenario is to understand whether this change will have an impact in your cost, in your scope, in your schedule, in your quality parameters, etc. etc. But it is very crucial to note here, guys, that the scenario is not presenting you the problem of assessing the impact of a change. Okay, it is presenting you the problem of resolving the concerns of your project team. And because of this thin line of difference, option number D is the correct answer to this question, and option C is incorrect. And most of the PMP exam candidates who are not able to understand this thin line of difference between addressing a concern of a project team and addressing the impact of a change that has happened in the project will get this question incorrect. Okay, so as a final learning, guys, whenever you get such questions in your PMP exam which talks about issue resolution, etc., etc., or maybe root causing, always first try to assess that what is the core issue the scenario is talking about. In this situation, the core issue the scenario is talking about is the concerns you need to address as a project manager in your project team. It is not talking about the core issue to do a impact analysis of a change that might or might not hit your project at a future stage. Okay, so that is why option C is a very close option, guys, but it's an incorrect option, and the correct answer to this question is option D.
I hope you liked the video. Please press the like button and I'll see you again in the next one.